Brad, and kindly have your seat. I intend to be swift so that you will have your lunch on time. But you're also getting spiritual lunch, so you don't want to eat that too fast because you may choke. But I know we've had some beautiful sermonettes, Dr. Johnson. Thank you. He's Dr. Johnson. He was my boss for many years. I served as assistant leader of the FM missions department, and he was in charge along with Dr. Sidman. So he would, Wence, we need to go here. And so it's great to have Dr. Johnson and Lady Johnson with us. And I also have friends, but it's great when you have friends who are actually family, and that's Obi and Jaton Martin. Obi is of the Martin clan, Jaton is of the Johnson clan, Bishop Victor Johnson of the Great Church of God. So thank you there, BFM/Church of God. I will leave that part out, right, Jaton? And of course, the family, of course, my wonderful mother and father-in-law, the Francises, Felicia and Shanton and Autumn, and the great Donna Lika. You don't even have to use a last name. Once I say Donna Lika, everybody just knows. Today, my friends, family, we're talking about sonship. Now, for the last several weeks, you've heard Apostle Sterling, Prophetess Masha talk about sonship. Literally and figuratively, Apostle's shoes, they're very big. I cannot fill them. So whatever expectation you have right now, you're not going to get it. Powerful man of God, and I am sitting, he talked about following, but I'm following him. Great man, a great, fantastic teacher. He talked last week about the prodigal son. Today's topic is from slavery to sonship, the kingdom concept of sonship. Because many times we think about slavery, and let me tell you, there are some misconceptions about what a slave is. For example, African Americans or people of African descent always thought that slavery began with them. That is so wrong. We weren't the first victims, we didn't invent it. So slavery actually happened if you look in your Holy Bible. Genesis, then Exodus. The very first book, then the very second book. So in between the creation of the world, some people decided they were going to have slaves, and thereby we have the book of Exodus, because that's where the slaves all ran out of Egypt. So they exit. So slavery dates back to the second book, well actually the first book of the Bible. And therefore, we have this concept that slavery is somehow a passage that all men would have went through who were perhaps of the African descent. But that's not true either, because there were freed Africans who were brought to the New World, but because they never were enslaved, they never had the spirit of slavery. Even in the Bahamas, there were persons who were brought from the continent of Africa. When they landed, they escaped. So they were never slaves. In fact, in America, there were persons, and if you watch the movie called 12 Years a Slave, he was in fact a free man who was conned into becoming a slave because he was black. But just to eliminate the concept that not because you are a black Bahamian or a black American meant that your descendants were in fact slaves. Doesn't apply to everyone. But based on the books you read, you may get that impression. So you have to look at who wrote those books, or who wrote those books. Also, if you look into the word slave, it actually came from the Slavic, which was a group of Caucasian people in Central Europe. And they were enslaved by the persons of Western Europe. And because they looked a little different, they had bigger lips, their skin was a little darker, but they were still Europeans. If an example of a Slavic person would be Melania Trump, Slovakia, well, it used to be Czechoslovakia, it's now the Czech Republic, and the nation of Slovenia, or the Slav Republic. So the point is, there are people who have been slaves far before the Africans were trafficked to the New World. And of course, slavery still exists today. What is slavery? Well, it's where a person is owned by another. So you are simply the property of another. What does that mean, to be the property of another? It means you have no free will. You have no right. So you can be a slave to something. Slavery is not only physical, it's also mental. Yeah. In fact, it is said that if you can make a person a slave mentally, you would never have to whip them. Because once you've affected the mind, everything else follows, because that's where your battle is. And so the point of it being property meant that slaves were raped, but because the concept of law did not apply to slaves, because if you were a property, you were like cattle, and you were interbred. Some scientists say that's why black men have the propensity to not be married but to have kids out of wedlock, because historically speaking, I don't necessarily agree with everything, but I'm disclosing, historically speaking, those who were slaves were never married to the woman. They would, like how you do pit bulls and golden retrievers, you mix, so you look for the choicest slave, muscles, and you find the choicest woman, and you interbred them, then you go look for another person, and that's how they were treated, because they were never regarded as human beings. Actually, in the U.S. Constitution, even though it says you have everyone has a right to be free, slaves weren't considered people. They were considered 2/3 actually humans, but 1/3 property, and therefore they didn't have that right that was accorded to people who weren't from that descent, until of course we come to the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln, and those things we'll touch on as we journey through this. But that's the concept of slavery. I wanted to set that so you get an appreciation for what it's like to be a slave. Now, our main text is taken from the book of Romans. It's 8:15 through 17. And I like to be interactive, so we'll have a volunteer. Anyone who has the book of Romans, 8:15 to 17, kindly stand up and read. This is your chance. I don't want to pick on you, but thank you, Madam Jatan.
For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Madam Martin. Someone else kindly read the Galatians 4:4-7.
When the time came to completion, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God.
Thank you very much, Brother Pratt. So what we have here, friends, the Apostle Paul is addressing two separate audiences, but I want you to note that there's a common theme, there's a common message. It's almost as if it's a replication, but it's not, because in one book or letter or epistle, which is another word for letter, Paul is speaking to the church. Now he's writing from Rome, but he's speaking to the church in Galatia. And so he's telling them certain things. And in his letter to the believers in Rome, that's what the book of Romans is about. He's presenting the gospel to the Romans. This is an introduction to the gospel of the Lord Jesus. But to the Galatians, they already heard the gospel. But the things of the world. So they began to backslide. And so Paul's message was that you were once a slave, but now you're free. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think for a moment that today you're a slave. Think about it. And someone makes a proclamation and says, you are free. And we'll get to that with the Emancipation Proclamation. What do you do? And I'm getting into the Bohemian dialect for a minute. Your mama was a slave. That's all she knew what to do. Your mama's mama was a slave. That's all she knew what to do. All you know is slavery. So even though somebody says you are free, what does that mean? Because your mind, so physically, you're no longer a slave, but mentally, you're still a slave because you don't know what freedom is, even though you have it. So what chances are you go right back to your master? Oh, it's like sin. You go back to the sin that you were delivered from because you've never lived without sin. We're going somewhere.
Yeah.
The change from slave to sons and heirs, because there are three different words. Slaves, sons, heirs. Three different concepts. Paul speaks about two opposing spirits. One was the spirit of slavery, and the other was the spirit of adoption. And Paul warns us, well, he warned the Galatians to do not go back to the spirit of slavery. Let's talk about adoption. Orphan Annie. Many of you have watched the movie. There's a more recent one with Jamie Foxx. But the concept of orphans and adoption is really the point of this little. And Annie said, Angie, why can't you give me a real home and folks like other kids? That's adoption. What is adoption? Adoption is a legal term, right? It's a process by which one person a child becomes the child of another. I need live examples. So I need a parent. I'd like to volunteer before I pick someone out. Parent, Pastor Denise. So Pastor Denise will be the parent, and I need a child. It doesn't have to be a pastor's biological child. It could be. It doesn't have to be. All right. Now I need another parent and another child. Go back. Mr. Sharma and another child. Okay. So adoption is the process of making somebody else's child your own. So this is her biological mom, just for the sake of this demonstration. If she was adopted by Pastor Denise, she becomes Pastor Denise's child, and Minister Sharma has no more child. Legally speaking, she has no more right. She cannot tell that child what to do. She has no rights to that child. That's what adoption is. Darkness has no more right to the child. So don't move here. And I intended for, because what I said is adoption is a legal, economic, and social status. So if Minister Sharma suddenly inherits $1 billion, as Sister Chara says, do you think she can inherit that now? No. there's a total separation. That's what a legal adoption is. But if Pastor Denise, if Pastor Denise had $2 million, I use it money just because it's easy, all right? Then when they both become heirs to Pastor Denise's fortune, right? That's what adoption does. So when she was a child of Sister Shama, she had no inheritance, none, in Pastor Denise's wealth. But when she was adopted, she now, she now became inherited. And so there was an economic change, but because the economic change had to do with the wealth being transferred. And then and societal change means in society, her name now changes to whatever Pastor Denise's name is. That is what adoption is. I wanted to give you a demonstration. So, I wanted to look at adoption from the mind of a lawyer, right? A lawyer doesn't just look at adoption as a fact where you receive the benefits. Go right back for the last time, I promise. But it's two ways. One, when the child is adopted, the child receives all of the benefits of the parent. All. But the child, the other side, the lawyer looks at it as the child also loses all of the benefits of the parents that is giving the child over for adoption. Now, Word of God says we were adopted because we were all born in sin and shapen in iniquity. The devil was our father.
Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord.
And you're the devil. So, whatever destiny, curse that was following the father, the son was going to inherit. But because of